Right, so welcome to Markers and Milestones, where we explore educational opportunities for young men and women beyond traditional college, all from a Christ-centered perspective. I'm Lee Bortons, and I'm here with my co-host, Amanda Kleist. Today is Wednesday, January 17th, 2024, and we're joined by Kevin R. Novak. He's a prosecuting attorney in Texas, as well as what I like to call a freedom maximalist. You can learn more about Kevin at deconstructingthecoliseum.com. Kevin, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, Lee. It's good to see you and Amanda, and I appreciate you asking about what it is I do.
Yeah, so we're always trying to let folks know there's just so many things we can do in life, and there's a lot of people wondering, what do you do after Challenge 4? What's next? And so we are looking at institutions as well as colleges, organizations, nonprofits, and then individuals also who can, point people in the right direction. So one of the things that's super popular in Classical Conversations Challenge program is how many young people want to be lawyers. And then they might sign up, and for a bachelor's in some related kind of degree, and they may stumble upon something else. I know that Amanda, your daughter, she's stuck in there, right? Did she get some law experience? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, so my daughter fell in love with mock trial
Hmm.
in Challenge B, which is when we do our mock trial case. And then I wanted her to get some real boots on the ground. So she had an internship in Orange County Family Court, working with the prosecutor's office there while she was in college, because I didn't want her getting into the legal field without, she's very good emotionally, without understanding the emotional cost of the daily life of the work. So she did that practice, and she's in a law adjacent field right now and thinking about law school, but she'd like to be able to afford it without going into debt. So she's purposed to work for a while and save up. So that's her arc.
Yeah, and we've had another guest on who started a paralegal program just so Christian kids who are interested in law could do a one-year program, sort of certification, to see if it's really what they wanted to do, because they can change their minds and there's a lot of money and commitment if you don't really know what's going on. So with that kind of setup, Kevin, why don't you tell us your background, tell us about your family, and then tell us kind of your educational journey and how you got to where you are now.
Sure. So I'm in Fort Worth, Texas, and so I work for the county, Tarrant County. It's actually the biggest red county in the country. We're hanging on. It's going to be close, but I have a wife, a wonderful wife, and three kids. They are 8 and 6, so you can probably hear them in the background a little bit, having a good time. And so I'm very blessed. And I'm not a very expressive person, but when I say that I'm blessed, I really mean that. So I'm very blessed. So when I went to college originally, I went to Northern Illinois University. I think at that point I was exploring Christianity. I wasn't a Christian, but I think I was obviously headed in that direction. I had a lot of questions. I dabbled in philosophy, and I really was just right there, but it took a few years. In my mid-20s, I started volunteering in a basketball ministry. So I was volunteering in a basketball ministry even before I was a Christian. And because I loved basketball, and that was the hook. And I was at Medina Baptist, which is in the western suburbs of Chicago, and just had a good time for a couple of years, and working with coaching high schoolers, high school men, boys, and then ultimately became a Christian. At the time, I was working for an insurance company, State Farm, and I was making a pretty good living. It was pretty easy. I was doing claims adjusting, and there's a lot of overlap actually with that and what I do now. But I knew that I wanted to do more, but I hadn't gotten married just yet. I remember actually my wife and I were just revisiting this the other day, where when Hurricane Katrina hit, State Farm was taking people for the catastrophe team. Like, hey, if you're ready to go work remote, like work in Louisiana and travel, we'll take you. And I remember I just met my wife. I hadn't gotten married yet, but I kind of knew, like, that was a good deal. And so I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I stayed. We got married. but I knew after a while, after having become a Christian and reading a lot of books, that I could do more. And there's nothing wrong, obviously, with not going to law school, but I just felt like I had that internal motivation and drive that I could do more, and that's how I was built and designed. It just wasn't ready for me previously to go to law school, and I don't know that I would have been able to accomplish it without Corinne. So we moved to Virginia. I went to law school, the best law school in the world, Liberty University School of Law. And I graduated, took the bar exam, and then I practiced for a little while in Virginia. It's a great place to practice, but it's a rural area and there's not a lot of volume there. And there's some good opportunities, but ultimately we ended up in Texas where we have some family. And I started doing prosecution work about 4 years ago. So it's been a great journey. In my fallible way, I wish it would have been a more compact way of getting to where I am now. But I know this is going to sound unbelievable, but just today I was at work thinking like, this is exactly where I need to be, and I'm primed to do some more great things. So I feel like I'm in a good position. It took me a while to get here, but that's essentially my journey in a nutshell.
Can you back up and tell me what was the basketball ministry? I'm just curious.
So the way it worked is we would have games on a Saturday and we would have one practice during the week. And I would just give a short devotional, or I wasn't a Christian at the time, but the coach that was a Christian would give a devotional. Once I became a Christian, I started doing it and getting more involved with mentorship. But it was basically just bring the young guys in, talk to them about Jesus and try to mentor them a little. And then they would play a game on Saturday. And I think it was good for me because it wasn't benign. It was competitive, and it was masculine, and it was intense. And I probably yelled a little more than I should have, but it was enjoyable. And I think God used sports to really bring me into the fold.
But was it the ministry through just that church, or was it Upwards or FCA, somebody that's famous, or?
No, actually it was local, and
Okay.
it was part of the Chicagoland Christian Sports Conference, I think is what we called it. But there were different churches, but it wasn't part of FCA, but probably in some ways operating under the same model. But it was very successful. In fact, when I was in high school, I played in it 1 year, and that's how I had remembered to go back to it about 7 years later. So
The reason I'm asking, Amanda, we haven't really gone down the sports track. It would be interesting. Everyone thinks you have to go to college to play sports, to maybe have some markers and milestone folks that didn't go to college and managed to play professional sports. So
Yeah, I got a baseball guy that we can talk to.
good. Yeah, those guys, boy, they hardly ever go into college because they start them
Right.
off so young, right?
well, there's a lot of changes now, especially with college athletics. And a lot of people don't like the changes, but I'm doing my best to view them through a Christian lens. Baseball, of course, is one of those avenues where you could, if you could make the majors or at least play professionally in the minor leagues without going to college, that's okay. And so, football and basketball, a lot of people don't want to give up the model that exists with college football and basketball because I think it's more for selfish reasons. They like watching the way it exists now, but I like freedom, and I say, hey, let's let people do what they want to do, what the market is leading them to do.
I think that we would all agree with that. Okay, so tell us about your 4 years as a prosecutor. So I guess what I find really interesting is people always think of, trial lawyers, and not everyone's a trial lawyer. You actually do court time, right?
Mhm.
You're not just someone that because a lot of lawyers just push paper around.
Yeah, and that actually, as I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today, being an administrator and a bureaucrat can sometimes be one of the downfalls to lawyering and trying to stay away from it. And I do tell some of the other like the younger lawyers or even just other attorneys who I think might be just in a lull, and trying to get them to maybe re-engage. And I need this too. It's not like I'm lecturing them, but just reminding myself of what I can do so that I'm not just a bureaucrat pleading cases. So I do courtroom activities. I'll litigate things. Trial is something that we're all trying to get into, because while it's unfortunate, we have to try a case. Sometimes we have to use force and coercion to punish someone, and that's trial. But a lot of times I'm in court, like today I was in court dealing with an emergency protective order for a victim who was injured by her boyfriend, or I might be presenting evidence in court and trying to get someone's probation revoked. There are times when I'm in court just pleading cases and negotiating allocutions. Those are times when victims get to go into court and tell the defendant what they really think. And so there are times when I'm in court, and I like that. I was just talking to one of my associates today about being in court, because it makes me feel like a lawyer, like I'm not just sitting around behind a computer and just being bureaucratic or being an administrator. Now, having said that, there certainly is nothing wrong with doing computer work or being a lawyer in that way. I think that the pitfall is to just make sure that we're focusing on how we can advance Christianity and Christian principles while doing it. So like if someone is like a mediator, they wouldn't necessarily be in courts, but they're trying to deal with both parties, and that certainly is a Christian idea. Their mediation is actually I think a burgeoning or blossoming field, especially on the Christian side, and it should be. We need more of that. Or people who deal with, say, like property law or contract law, a lot of times they're behind a computer. There's nothing wrong with that. We just don't want it to become bureaucratic and administrative.
Maybe define those terms a little better, because it seems to me like a contract lawyer would be pretty administrative and bureaucratic, but
Yeah.
yeah, so
I
explain
think we
that.
need those terms defined the way you're using them. Yes, I agree.
Well,
And then
and
once again, the reason I'm asking all these things is I'm hoping someone in our audience will listen and will be saying, yeah, I really want a law degree, but it's so broad. I don't know how to narrow my focus, and I don't really know how to even ask how the Lord would lead. So this is good that you've had they think about these things.
Well, and bureaucratic to me is probably a more pejorative word than administrative. So I'll talk about bureaucratic. So what I mean by bureaucratic is that you exist just to have your job and to earn your paycheck. And obviously with the political context we're dealing with now, with people talking a lot about Washington, D.C., or even some state capitals, where we get a lot of people in positions who are in those positions merely to exist and to earn a paycheck, but not to advance any principles. And I think that's what I mean by bureaucratic. And so when I talk about it's not a good idea to be bureaucratic as a lawyer. I think we need to always be looking at how we can achieve things, how we can advocate, how we can give wise counsel in a Christian context and really help people. I know that sounds cliche, but really help people or steer them in the right direction. And that's really what I'm talking about, because in the context of my job, where I could get bureaucratic is, well, there's a victim, there's a defendant. Well, okay, the defendant might plead guilty and do like 4 years prison time. Okay, well, but is that really the best I can do? Can I do more? And I'm not saying put the defendant in jail longer. I'm just saying maybe there are other things I can do to get a better outcome. And that's where like something like an allocution might come in handy, where the victim could confront the defendant in court and go on the record and vent, or at least tell, usually it's a female, tell usually the victim is a female, telling the defendant about how this affected her. So my point is trying to advance the ball further in mimicking or resembling Christian principles. Another good example would be restitution. Okay, someone's going to be on probation, which, by the way, I'm not a big fan of probation or prison, but we can talk, more about that some other time. But if someone's going to, okay, we'll agree they'll do 3 years probation. Well, wait a minute. This guy caused damage to a car. Well, okay, the victim was only out $250 deductible. Okay, well, but wait a minute, the insurance company had to pay money for that. So I try to keep those things in mind and inch forward as best I can. I'm not saying I always do that, but I try to keep in mind Christian principles in implementing them and in inching forward towards them when I'm doing my job. In terms of administrating, I suppose there's some overlap there with bureaucracy, because I don't just want to be someone who's a go-between between a victim and a defendant. And in other areas of law where, say, you are involved with property law, where you're basically negotiating and trying to counsel people about maybe what it is they're doing with the land, why it is there's property law, things like that, and just trying to infuse Christianity and Christian principles into what it is we do as lawyers. So that's really what I'm after, and not wanting to just settle in and be a lawyer in a secular sense, but be a lawyer in a Christian sense.
So Kevin, as you are talking about different types of lawyers, I know they're really clear in your head, but in law school, and you called it the best law school in the land, where you went to law school, what were the kinds of lawyers that you found there? And then obviously you've ended up here through decision making, but with that insurance background, it strikes me as you were probably had an affinity with several types of law that you were exposed to in law school. Help our audience out, young men, young Christian men and women from a Christ-centered worldview, understand what even are the right questions they might see when they're starting this journey about types of lawyers that they could look into.
Yeah, and I've talked about types of lawyers in terms of subject matter, but it really has more to do with the economics of the situation. So that's good that you're asking about that. So when you go into law school, you might get some people who are what would be called solo practitioners. Mm-hmm. So the term in the legal realm is you hang your own shingle. I don't know why that's the term, but there's somewhere out there's some etymology on it, but hang your own shingle, where you're a sole practitioner. So you have an office, you have an unlocked door, and people come in and ask you questions and hire you, and you pretty much do everything. You do property law, you do criminal defense, you do estate planning, things like that. So that's pretty much a sole practitioner. You also get people that might join a firm, and basically they're working on billable hours, so they're going to work a lot. Usually they're younger, maybe they travel. They're working in a highly populated area, like a big city or a capital, where there are lots of companies and civil organizations, and there are a lot of customers that can pay a lot of money in terms of needing sophisticated law and being able to pay for it. So you get that, and then you get somewhat in between. You do get smaller firms, like in medium-sized cities, where you might have 2 or 3 people that get together and say, well, we're going to practice law, we're going to share the expense of a legal secretary or a paralegal. You do get some niches, like you get injury attorneys. We've all seen those billboards, and that's very biblical. A lot of times those attorneys have a bad reputation, but I think it's biblical to be a plaintiff's injury attorney. So you could do that and work on a contingency. Basically, if you win if it not, well, I shouldn't say win, you could win a trial, but even if you earn a settlement, you get a percentage of that, and that's how you get paid. There are also attorneys that do what's called insurance defense. So you'd basically be doing the other side of it, where the insurance company would hire you as the attorney to do the defense for them. And then you get people like me. Obviously, you go in and work for the state or a county where you're doing prosecution work. Or you could do, if you're, and again, a high population area, you could do a just exclusively criminal defense. So there are some other types of professions you could enter into with a law degree. My understanding is that there are about 5% of people with a law degree go out and become authors. And then, of course, I'm not a fan of someone becoming a professor without having practiced, but that's of course always an option when they get a little older and have some experience under the belt.
Good. So you used some other terms early on to define for us. What exactly is a mediator? Are they necessarily a lawyer, or is that some sort of certification program?
Every state's a little different. I know that some lawyers do mediation
Yeah,
to
tell us what that
complement.
means. What's mediation?
Oh, okay. So basically mediation is where you have two parties that disagree on something. Usually they're disagreeing over money, or money is quantifying the underlying problem. And the mediator will basically get both sides together. They're not always in the same room, but in the same building, where the mediator will go back and forth and try to get those people to compromise and basically try to get them to settle. And its mediation, I think, is very helpful to Christianity, because we really shouldn't be, going to court necessarily against other Christians without doing our best to solve the problem beforehand. And that's actually not something that we're currently practicing well as Christians. We could be doing a lot more of that. That's why I said earlier, we need more of it. But we need mediation is basically that, trying to help the parties, an independent person that knows nothing about the situation, going in and saying, well, what are your thoughts and feelings about this? That's party A. And then party B, what are your thoughts and feelings about this? And then trying to get them to come to some type of resolution without having to go to court.
You said that had a lot to do with money, but doesn't family law a place where there's a lot of mediation also?
Well, yeah, there can be mediation. I think a lot of that has more to do with the attorneys just interacting with each other. But there can be mediation in family law also. I can't say that I recall, I did some family law when I was in Virginia. I can't say that I recall using mediation for family law, but you can use mediation for any type of issue. Obviously, the parties would need to agree to it. A lot of times it's court required, but in those situations where there's basically no hope of the parties coming to an agreement, the court appointed or court required mediation is just something that's neglected. But yeah, you can have mediation in pretty much any context, even in a situation where, I mean, you think of even in church, if you have a problem with someone, you might need to bring in a third party to help you address the situation.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, so Kevin, thank you so much for this explanation. And you've kept using this word Christian. I think we have a common definition, but because not everybody who uses the word Christian would have a common definition, help us understand a little bit about where you're pulling your Christian from, however you're going to define that for me. And then after that, I'd love to hear, how many Christians do you see in the law profession on your daily life based on how you're defining Christian?
Mm-hmm. Well, in saying someone's a Christian, I would use the terms that John Piper wrote a book called Finally Alive, which I would recommend people read.
Okay.
And he enumerates the terms that he thinks are the mechanisms for someone becoming a Christian. And those terms are regeneration, born again in John 3, chapter 3 with, I think it was Nicodemus. And so born again, made alive in Christ. Those are, I think there are a couple others, but those are the terms that I would rely on as a modern evangelical. And the Holy Spirit circumcising someone's heart and making them part of the larger body. Romans 11, I think, is where it's grafting in. There's a grafting in of the Christian. But so that's how I would define a Christian. And that's good because obviously there are some people who might think they're Christians, or more specifically people in other nations that, I think Erwin Lutzer said once that when he would travel to Europe, he would, especially Turkey, he would use the term follower of Jesus or follower of Christ. So, but anyway, I think I'm fortunate where I am, and let me back up. There's an old saying that criminal lawyers treat each other civilly, and civil lawyers treat each other criminally. And
That's nice.
Have you heard that before?
Yes, I like it. It's nice and tight. Yeah.
And I generally it's true. Now that's painting with a broad brush, but I will say, based on where I practice, we're pretty civil with one another. And part of that, I don't think I've ever seen where the defendant or the victim was ever done harm by that, because some people might say, well, you guys know each other and you'll do whatever and you'll sell me out. I've never seen that. And certainly that could be someone's perspective on that. I get it, but I don't think it's legitimate, because at the end of the day, lawyers are dealing with each other at arm's length, and we're trying to advocate, and we can do that civilly. And we need to be civil with one another because we see each other all the time. There aren't that many criminal defense lawyers in Fort Worth or Tarrant County. So we have to be nice to one another. In terms of how many are Christians, thankfully, there are a good number. I wouldn't say a majority, but a good plurality of people who are Christians. And the nice thing is, even though a lot of them aren't Christians, a lot of them are still what I would call God-fearing, or at least conservative, in that if I'm talking to them about something, they're on the same page. And this is one of those areas where, and again, this is maybe another conversation, but criminal law, and this is part of the reason why I like it, is still one of those areas of law that, for the most part, resembles Christianity. Not necessarily the punishments, but the crimes: stealing, murder, lying, things like that, where, people that are not Christians, or maybe even are liberals, who are not being consistent with their worldview, are still in the boat of saying that stealing and lying and murdering are wrong. So in that regard, there's not a lot of disagreement with those particular issues. And I think I'm fortunate in that regard. By the way, I think one of the enjoyable parts of what I do is negotiations, because once a week I go to court, and I liken it to speed dating, where I have like 20 defendants on the docket, and they all come to court, and all these attorneys sit across from me. We sit across from one another. We just talk about the case. Like, where are we on the case? What are the strengths and weaknesses? What's your position? Things like that, issues. And oftentimes we get into discussions about Christian issues. And I love that, because we can start talking. I can start talking to them about like restitution, or the personal injury damages, or things like that. And it's neat for me, because that's an outlet for me. I don't get to talk to defendants, and when I talk to victims, I have to be careful, because not because I'm afraid of proselytizing to them, but because it's over the phone most of the time, and that's not necessarily the best avenue to talk to someone who's vulnerable and injured. but I like talking to the other attorneys because I get to, kind of plant the seed. And so, yeah, there are a good amount of Christians with what I do, and including in my office. I should say every morning at 8 o'clock, we pray in my office.
Mm.
Sometimes it's just two of us. Sometimes there are like 4 or 5 of us, but we do it every morning at 8. And there are a good amount of Christians in the office that, we kind of help one another, pray for one another, and toss issues around with one another. And so it's a good time.
Could you describe what restitution is according to the Bible, and then how you see that mirrored in your actual office? Or is it still kind of two strange different things to people? They don't like, do they try to make it biblical restoration, or is there a different set of rules?
Yeah, there are a different set of rules. So restitution amounts are basically just agreed upon amounts. I don't know of there being a limit in a criminal plea.
Wait, back up. So restitution is when you pay money to somebody to make
Yes.
up for something?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Lee. You're always reminding me that I need to break things down a little better. So thank you for that. Yeah. So restitution is basically making someone whole for the money damages they lost, and this is I think a good example. It's a difficult example, but if you have, say, a father, someone who's working that dies, you have to quantify that in terms of what money he would have made over the lifetime in taking care of his family. And so that, of course, would be another example of restitution. Now, it can get complex, number of years, whether you have to multiply it. So in the Bible, there are examples of paying someone back more than one fold. And I think that's for punishment purposes. But when we get into restitution, because someone was making money and they're no longer alive, then we get into trying to make the family whole so that they can survive. I think the Old Testament, there is a large emphasis on economics, and I'm okay with that. I don't think God looks at us as economic commodities. I just think that money is an easy way of quantifying things. If someone loses their eye, then you have to quantify that. What's that worth? And there's a movie, gosh, I can't remember the name. It's a real popular legal movie. But there's a case that deals with the value of a hand, like a burnt hand. You might think of like Johnny Tremaine, I guess, is what comes to mind. You burn your hand. If someone's responsible for that, you have to quantify that. And so I don't think there's any tension there with when Jesus says, well, we're not going to do eye for an eye anymore. I think what is being said there is you don't need to literally poke someone's eye out in order to make them even. We're dealing here with money damages, and we're dealing with, well, that's another issue, is forgiveness. That's something that a court can't litigate. But anyway, restitution at the end of the day, just trying to make someone whole. It could be returning the property if it still exists. Where's the property? Can you give it back to that person? So that's really what we're talking about there in terms of restitution.
Does forgiveness ever play into the allocutions that you talked about?
I can't say that most of the time someone says that they have forgiven the person, but I got to tell you, I am so often impressed by victims and how they have forgiven people. I mean, I've dealt with death cases, intoxication cases where death has resulted. And I sometimes am so inspired at how people can forgive others. Whether they've really truly forgiven, I don't know, only God knows that. But in terms of the words that they say in court and the emotions they display, yeah, I mean, it does seem like sometimes people forgive, and they do talk about that in court. The allocution is something that is designed to give someone some type of relief. A lot of times the person giving the allocution will say, well, it didn't do anything for me. And I understand that too. But it can be, I think a way of getting across a point to someone and really making it personal, because the defendant is dealing with an attorney. They're not dealing with the victim. And I think it needs to be made personal to that person. And by the way, I don't mean to go too long on restitution, but I think money damages is important in a criminal context too, because when that person is working, they should be remembering why they're doing it. In other words, if they have to pay restitution, that should be part of what they're remembering and why they're doing it.
Mm.
And that's important to me.
Interesting. I have a lot of questions, Amanda. You go next.
Yeah, and obviously we have more questions than we'll have time for, given
Yeah.
such an interesting topic in person. But this is a question that is going to be outside of what we've all been talking about right now, because markers and milestones, one of the things we're helping everybody think about a little bit more is your life is not your job, and that you are connected to your local church for whatever reason, and you're given to them. So you heard me say in the beginning, I wanted my daughter to do an internship so she could figure out how to bring home what she needed to bring home from the offices in which she worked and get the right support in it, because it's not an easy thing to see all the things you've described for anybody. So how do you not bring the office home? How does your church help you succeed without doing your job, without, being in the way of doing your job? What are some things somebody could look for or practice?
Well, actually, so the thing about your life not being your job, that's really good. I like that. I think in terms of lawyering, I will say that a lot of times becoming a lawyer or just deciding to go to law school is a function of who you are anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But I still agree with you. So I'm not disagreeing with you in saying that. I guess what I'm saying is we're competitive, just like people who start businesses or, go to grad school, whatever example. People who feel like they have a higher calling and they want to work towards it and they want to be a guardian or steward of society and culture and politics. So in terms of the job not being my life, I do, and I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for, but there are little things I do. I don't know. And this is one of the luxuries of what I do. I don't want to have to manage a business. So there are trade-offs depending on what type of law you practice, but I don't bring my computer home generally. I will if I'm doing grand jury work or if I've got a trial, but that's not like, that might be every few months or whatever. I don't get email on my personal phone.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't drink alcohol. There are a lot of attorneys that abuse alcohol, and I'm not judging them. I'm just saying that's one of the pitfalls. I've been in court and I've come across it. I think having good boundaries. I also think, one of the things they told us right away when we went to Liberty is don't try to lawyer your spouse. And that's something I don't do. And I don't know that I would really be able to do that anyway. I always told Corinne, she should have been the one to go to law school, because I'll be telling her what I think is this complex fact pattern or issue, and she'll just be like, oh yeah, I get that. That's this. And I'm like, okay, like it might have taken me a little longer to understand it or distill it. So I don't bring that home, or at least I try not to. I'm not going to try to use a ton of, I'm not saying I won't be logical with my wife. We should be logical with each other, but I'm not going to do that to her. I also think that making my job a Christian job, or at least being a Christian while I'm there, helps me, because that paces me, that keeps me, I think, even tempered. And so I think those are just things off the top of my head where I can have some good boundaries. And I think prosecutors in general are like that, most of the time, like, unless it is urgent or someone's sick or something, we're not texting each other all the time about like, hey, do this, do that, because we know we have to have a good work-life balance. So
you help one another. And then what about your church? How does that help you?
Oh yeah, okay. So Well, I think, I don't know, I don't know about my church specifically. I think, I think there are people in my church that I'll talk to, like on a week, not necessarily a weekly basis if I don't have a chance to, but and just have them pace me. Obviously, listening to a sermon that helps me stay grounded and not thinking um, that I'm an exalted type of person or even with what I do. Paradoxically, as you two, I think would agree, the more responsibility you have, the more people that you are responsible to and responsible for. So I think keeping that in mind and just knowing that those people at church are pacing me in terms of in being a good person and staying in the guardrails and staying humble, and just trying to be, I know I have a good idea of the kind of person that I don't go to when I want to talk about an issue or get advice. And I try to be the opposite of that, and just trying to be available for people and challenge them. But obviously the church with the messages we're getting and just keeping me humble and trying to remember. And I can't say that I really walk around like I don't think I have an exalted sense of myself to begin with, but we all struggle with pride at some point, and just trying to remember that I am someone that others look to, and I need to exercise that responsibility. And obviously church helps in that regard. So
It's good. Your question makes me think, man, about my church, because ours is a military church, and those men are there because they need each other's support in so many ways. But I've never heard of like a lawyer's church or prosecutor's church. Yet justice is a major element in all of Christianity. So I think that's why we're asking that question to see if anything different stood out. It sounds like you have good people around you at work that can help you with those
yeah,
parameters too.
I was just thinking of that as you were talking. I think I do try to have mechanisms in place no matter my season in life. Obviously, there are times where, you might be at church more for this, or, if someone's in the retirement stage or single, like I talked about basketball ministry. So I think this season of life, we all read a lot of books. I'm listening to a book on education. I'm listening to Augustine, his Confessions, which is just awesome. So I think with my prayer group at work and the other things that I do, I feel like I've got some guardrails. I wish I could do more and having time to do more things, but I think in this season of life, those are the mechanisms that are keeping me on the right track.
That sounds good. So, one thing I'd like you to speak to is how some ideas of liberalism have kind of destroyed parts of the justice system. Specifically, I know you have a strong opinion on hate crimes and have a stance there. Could you maybe explain that and tell us what you do differently?
Yeah, that hate crimes is a good example. I think where there are going to be parts of the law that don't comport with Christianity. So hate crimes, I know we've talked about this before. A hate crime is basically an enhancement or a higher degree of punishment for the crime being motivated by some type of protected class. And I'm not saying that those crimes don't take place. Of course they do. But at the end of the day, people rob, steal, and murder because of the image of God and because of the lack of respect for God. And that is the punishment that ought to be, I guess, reconciled, not this additional punishment for hate. I think that, and this bleeds over into the education realm, but God has dominion over hate, and only God can see what that hate is. And besides that, I think when someone is committing a crime, and there's a term for the degree of culpability, and that term is mens rea. So mens rea, when you hear the term intentional or knowingly or purposefully or negligently, that's the degree of culpability. So someone might have done something on accident, or they might have done something intentionally. And if you do something intentionally, but you do it because you hate that person, I don't believe that that's biblical. I believe that you ought to just suffer the punishment for the crime and not have a necessarily an enhancement on that degree of punishment. So we struggled with that issue. I think I struggled with it with COVID time because, you know, you've got these state of emergency clauses in constitutions, and it's like, wait a minute. If you can do whatever you want just by signing a piece of paper and bypassing the Constitution, why do we have constitutions? And so I didn't like that, and to my knowledge, I don't think I ever enforced one of those enhancements. And so there are a lot of those things. So let me speak more broadly, if I can, briefly. Years ago, you had a movement, and if anyone is familiar with what's called the Model Penal Code, MPC, and you've got these different movements that started many, many years ago. I guess I'm just guessing, maybe in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And obviously they would have developed steam in the 50s, and especially the 60s and 70s, where we had a lot of liberal movements gaining momentum. But anyway, with the Model Penal Code, what that was an attempt to do, and they're doing this in all areas of law, there are groups that want to make the laws the same in every single state. And that's bad. We don't want to do that, because what we want the states to basically, I don't really like the idea of states being these laboratories. People use that term like, oh, we'll see what works. That's another conversation, but I'm not a fan of that. But I think we have to have decentralized power, more specifically, decentralized authority. But anyway, you get these groups that are trying to make the uniform law, the uniform commercial code, the uniform criminal statutes, the uniform this, the uniform that, and they don't like the idea of there being different laws in different states, because that bothers them. They think there's an unequal application of the law. And that's not a good thing, because it is in the process of centralizing law. And also what that does is I know I'm getting deep in the weeds here, but bear with me here for a moment.
Go ahead.
This is an exciting topic here that I'm about to get into. The Model Penal Code is statutory, which means that the legislatures in each state would pass new laws saying, okay, this is now the criminal statute for this particular law. But what a lot of that did was it overrode what's called the common law. And when I say common law, I'm talking about William Blackstone, the Old English law, where that was a greater function of Christianity. That's the short version of what has happened in the modern sense of law. And even the Constitution, the federal Constitution, invokes the term common law, and that was invoking William Blackstone, or even Kent here in the United States, where he had this common law where they were trying to interface that law with Christianity. And someone can read William Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. It's available free online. But anyway, that was another movement that went into these different areas of law and tried to change it and tried to make it so it was not reflecting the common law, which was a function of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So I could go on, obviously we could get into specific examples of liberalism in the law, but I think that suffices for now in terms of the liberal infusion and problem that we've headed into.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time anyway, Kevin. So what you share with us, I thought was super interesting, and it really opens up the spectrum of, I'm just not going to be, not for a young person saying I'm going to be a lawyer, to saying I'm going to be a lawyer. Why and for what purpose and goal, and how can I serve the body of Christ? So thanks for being on. Amanda, do you have any final comments or questions?
Well, one, I've enjoyed the conversation, but here's the question, Kevin, that we occasionally ask people, and it's intrinsically unfair. So I'm going to ask you anyway. You've had a varied career. I'll observe that. So we often ask, what would you like to tell your 18-year-old self and have your 18-year-old self listen to that you'd like to pass along to this audience?
Hmm. Well, that is a tough question.
Mm-hmm.
And to be complimentary to myself now and unfair to my 18-year-old self, that would probably be a very long conversation. Obviously, I would want to have been a Christian sooner,
Okay.
but I would say explore philosophy, but specifically philosophy of thinking, and try to connect that with Christianity. And that's where I think you'll get excitement in any field. At least that's where I get excitement in any field. And the reason why I would say that to my 18-year-old self is because I was searching and I was looking at man's philosophies, Descartes and Kant and all these philosophers that did not have the answers, and they were just stumbling in the dark. But if I would have come to Christianity sooner and then connected that to everyday life, then that would have really moved things along a lot more quickly for me and helped me decide what my arc would have been sooner. So that would be my advice to my younger self and then the audience.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's great advice, by the way.
Yes,
All
it is.
right.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, guys. We'll see you later.
Okay,
Bye. Have a
thanks
good
for having
one.
me on. Appreciate
You're
it.
so welcome, Kevin. Thank you.